Hi, I'm Reverend Ryk Brown. Welcome to St. James United Church in Waterdown, Ontario, Canada. For Pentecost Sunday this year, we're still in isolation and still worshiping online. So we asked you to send in some flame pictures of yourself and a flame to celebrate the fire of the Holy Spirit on Pentecost Sunday, and this is what you sent in for us. So thank you for sending those in. We asked you for flame pictures, and then unfortunately this week, those flames were interrupted by these flames. So, where do we find God in all of this? And how in the world do we connect these events to Pentecost Sunday in a way that helps us better understand God's purpose for us in the world? Well, before we can answer those questions, we have to start by asking ourselves a far more basic question, and that is, why are we talking about this at all? But even before we get to that question, we need to first pause and stop here for a moment and honor the memory of George Floyd, whose life was taken too soon. This picture is George with his mother, the one that he was pleading for while he was gasping for air. George Floyd was a black man who was senselessly murdered by a white police officer in a position of power and authority, while 3 other police officers looked on and did absolutely nothing to stop and intervene and prevent the murder from happening. In a country that was already torn apart by racial division, inequality, injustice, and racial violence. And in response, George's city erupted in flames and outrage. And now other cities are following suit. But this is nothing new. If you're anywhere near my age, you've seen this before. In fact, it goes way beyond my age. Racial injustice and inequality have existed in America since the day the first Europeans set foot on North American soil. Black Americans live with the reality of systemic racism every single day. And white Canadians only seem to talk about it when it rises to the level that is so shocking and tragic that it makes international news. Why is that? And if you don't understand why the rioting and looting are happening, and you think that they are just as bad as the death of George Floyd, then you need to stop talking and start listening. Late night talk show host Trevor Noah explained it very well. And I think right now it's important for us as white people to listen to a black person's explanation rather than listening to more white people. Trevor describes it as a series of dominoes, and we don't see the connection between the dominoes until they start to fall. The first domino that he identifies was COVID-19 itself. Not simply the stress of living in isolation for over 2 months, but the fact that the virus disproportionately affects the Black community more than the white community, and not for genetic reasons, but for socioeconomic reasons. Simply put, they have poorer access to health care. And that difference revealed what the Black community already knew in the States, that there were huge issues of systemic equality in their society. And the next domino that Trevor identifies for us is that of Ahmaud Arbery, who was murdered by 2 white self-appointed vigilantes just for jogging down the street. And they were not charged until after the public outrage started. And the next domino to come along was that of Amy Cooper in Central Park, who blatantly and deliberately weaponized her whiteness against Christian Cooper's blackness.
There is an African-American man. I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog. I'm sorry, I can't hear you either. I'm being threatened by a man in the ramble. Please send the cops immediately.
I'm going to call 911 and tell them that an African American man is threatening my life. Those were her words. Let the venom of those words sink into your ears for a moment. I'm going to call 911 and tell them that an African American man is threatening my life. Why? Because he asked her to leash up her dog, and she refused. So she called the police to tell them that her life was in danger from a Black man. And it revealed that she knew, that action revealed that she knew that she could use skin color as a weapon for her advantage. And it confirmed for the whole Black community across the United States what they already suspected and believed in their hearts, and that is that white people really are willing to use their knowledge of skin color racism to put Black people's lives in danger. White people are willing to knowingly do that. And then, of course, the next domino to fall was that of the murder of George Floyd. Murdered by a police officer who had no reason to fear for his safety. 4 against 1, and George was flat on the ground, handcuffed on his stomach. He couldn't move. He wasn't going anywhere. He was not resisting arrest. He was just laying there, and the officer felt the need to kneel on his neck until he was dead. The officer was able to take his life, and he did. And Trevor says it's almost like he knew he could get away with it, that there would be no repercussions. And then the final domino was that the officer who committed that murder wasn't charged, he was just fired. Now, I know he's been charged since then, but the rioting started before he was charged. The rioting started when it became public knowledge that he was just fired, and that's it. Now, how many people do you know personally who could get away with murder in a way that the consequences for them would be to just get fired and nothing else? So that's when the real outrage erupted. And almost immediately, commentators and even police chiefs from across the United States condemned the killing. But it wasn't enough to stop the outrage from erupting in Minneapolis. But really, when you think about it, those are the dominoes that Trevor identifies for us, that were back-to-back events in a series that created the calamity that resulted in the rioting. But really, the first domino wasn't COVID-19. The dominoes have been falling for the Black community for years, for decades, for centuries. For 400 years, since 1619, when the first African slaves were brought to North American soil. Trevor points out that society exists because we have a social contract with each other where we agree to live together in peace and harmony, and we agree together to abide by a certain set of rules to keep the peace with each other. And we agree to empower certain people to enforce those rules for the good of all of us. And without that contract, there is only anarchy. And anarchy has never worked as a system of government throughout history because it always just leads to a tyranny of the biggest bully. And the social contract between us only works if it applies equally to all of us. And when the people who are empowered to enforce that social contract for us are able to freely act against it and are not held accountable for their actions by it, and when it is unfairly imposed upon one group of people more so than another group of people, and when government leaders publicly encourage the inequality and injustice, then the social contract is broken. At which point, why would anybody abide by it? So at this point, as Trevor again says, the question isn't for us, why are people looting? The question is, why not loot under these circumstances? Down go the dominoes again and again. And the only reason we're talking about this today is because George Floyd died. And somebody caught it on camera. But this happens in America every single day. How many George Floyds are there out there daily who do not die and who don't get international media attention for their plight? What must it be like to grow up in a society knowing that someone will have their knee on your neck, whether figuratively or literally, every single day for the rest of your life just because of your skin color? You know, the looting upsets us when we watch it on TV because we realize that the people doing it are ripping up the social contract that we thought they had agreed to. Now imagine what it would be like to live in a world where you see that social contract being ripped up in your face every single day. How would you feel? That's why the looting is happening. That's why the rioting is happening. So I asked a police officer friend of mine, his name's Perry Mason, and yes, that's his real name. I asked Perry for his view on what's happened this week. Now, Perry is not just any retired police officer. He spent most of his career dealing specifically with violence against children and youth in schools and at home. And he sat on several anti-violence and anti-bullying agencies locally and even across the country. And he is also an expert in restorative justice practices. And in retirement now, he still works as a restorative justice mediator. So I thought he'd be a good person to get a perspective from. And I'll tell you the truth, his response surprised me. He said, all police officers are racist. Let that sink in a minute. A police officer is saying all police officers are racist. Because all police officers are human, and all humans are racist, Perry said. I had to pause and think about that. He said, we're all predisposed to be comfortable around our own kind and to feel fear around those who are different from us. And until every single one of us is willing to confront our own racism inside us, then this violence will continue. I have to agree with him. And he said, there are only two fundamental emotions in life: love and fear. And all other emotions are derivative from those two, based on those two. And in any given situation we find ourselves in the world, we can choose between love or fear for our action. You know, in church we have a word for that, to describe our human tendency to choose to act out of fear instead of choosing to act out of love. We call that sin. Racism is a form of fear. Rioting is a form of fear. Fear that we will never be able to live in a society that will treat us with love. So why keep trying if nobody's going to love us? That's what leads to rioting. So the problem here is not merely racism, because as Perry says, we're all racist. But the problem is systemic racism. When the structures of society support and encourage fear and racism, then society is in big trouble. And to us white Canadians, we think that systemic racism and inequality is so much more blatant in the United States than it is here in Canada. So we fill ourselves with pride, believing that we're better than the United States. We don't have racial riots here. We don't have systemic racial inequality here. We treat everybody equally. This is Canada. But if we really listen to our black neighbors, our brown neighbors, and especially our Indigenous neighbors, we'll find that systemic racism and public racism do exist in Canada. You know, I would never kneel on the neck of a restrained, prone, immobilized, motionless black man for 8 minutes until he died. I know I would not do that. But would I have the courage to intervene if I was on the sidewalk walking by? Would I have the courage to intervene against an armed police officer to prevent the death from happening? Would I have the courage to do that in front of 3 other armed police officers who were doing nothing to stop the death happening right in front of them? Would I be willing to risk my own safety in order to save another man's life? Or would I just walk on by? If I'm not actively part of the solution, then I am passively part of the problem. And I pride myself in believing that I am not a racist, because I would never do or say anything racist. But do I have the courage to stop it when I see it or hear it? Or what about the small or subtle expressions of racism, the ones that seek to go unnoticed? Do I have the courage to challenge those when I encounter them? Or am I more concerned about avoiding an argument with somebody who's probably not going to listen to what I have to say anyway, so why bother trying? So do I just say nothing and walk away? And am I blind to the child's eyes that watches me walk away and who just learned from my actions that racism in Canada is tolerated? If I'm not actively part of the solution, then I am passively part of the problem. And I am enabling and allowing the problem of racism to continue. And if I am enabling it, then I am a racist. Here's the harder part. Am I willing to examine myself for the stereotypes that I've learned from society that I unconsciously act on without even recognizing it? Am I willing to do that work to find those things in myself? What is needed here right now is not our Canadian pride that our culture is better than our neighbors, and what is not needed here is our personal pride in knowing that we would never do anything like this. What is needed is our humility to admit that we might not stop it when we see it. And that is unacceptable. And we need to change that. When you admit that you are capable of choosing fear over love, only then does God's Spirit empower you to choose love. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. And suddenly, from heaven, there came a sound like a rush of violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in words that made no sense to us about their experiences of oppression, inequality, and systemic racism, each as the Spirit gave them ability. If you can't understand what they're saying, then stop talking and listen. Thanks be to God.